I am not afraid of an army of lions led by a sheep. I am afraid of an army of sheep led by a lion. These words, attributed to Alexander, encapsulate the essence of the man whose military prowess and leadership were unparalleled. Few names in history resonate with the grandeur and awe-inspiring legacy of Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BC in the ancient kingdom of Macedonia, Alexander would rise to become not just a king, but a legend whose story transcends. His life, marked by unparalleled military genius, ambitious conquests, and a vision that stretched far beyond the known world of his time, continues to captivate and inspire generations. In 334 BC, a young Macedonian king embarked on a military expedition that would etch his name into the annals of history. This king, Alexander of Macedonia, was a mere 20 years old when he began his campaign against the Persian Empire, the reigning superpower of the age. His journey, laden with fearless leadership and tactical brilliance, led to a series of victories that would eventually see him carve out one of the largest empires the world has ever known. To the Persians, he was a curse, but to the Western world, he was immortalized as Alexander the Great. The story begins around 500 BC in ancient Greece, a rugged land witnessing unprecedented developments in art, philosophy, and warfare. The era's two most prominent city-states were Athens, a naval power where democracy, art, drama, and philosophy flourished, and Sparta, an austere, militaristic society famed for its formidable army. In 480 BC, these two city-states had joined forces to fight an invasion by the mighty Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force, led by 300 Spartans, held up the enormous Persian army for 3 days before they were finally encircled and killed. Then, in the Straits of Salamis, the Greek fleet defeated the Persian navy. But they couldn't prevent the Persians from burning the sacred temples of the Athenian Acropolis. The next year, at Plataea, the Greeks won a decisive land battle against the Persians and forced them to abandon their invasion. But rising tension between Athens, Sparta, and their allies eventually led to war, dragging the Greek world into decades of destructive fighting. While Athens and Sparta engaged in decades of war, a new power was rising in the north, Macedonia. Under King Philip II, Macedonia transformed from a perceived backwater into a formidable military force. His most famous reform was the introduction of the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, and wielded by trained infantry fighting in close formation, known as a phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the joint forces of Thebes and Athens. Through alliance and conquest, Philip had already gained control over most of his neighbors. Following this victory, he united all of Greece in an alliance known as the Hellenic League, or League of Corinth, with Philip as hegemon or supreme commander. Only Sparta stood aside. Philip began to plan a great campaign against the Persian Empire, but on the eve of launching his war, Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard, a victim of Macedonia's brutal court rivalries. This tragic event set off a chain of events that would shape the course of history. After King Philip's death in 336 BCE, Alexander, at the young age of 20, found himself thrust into a position of immense responsibility. Although just a 20-year-old, Alexander was brilliant, restless, and tutored by the great philosopher Aristotle and already an experienced military commander. Alexander inherited his father's grand plan to invade Persia, but first, he had to secure his own position as king. He faced the formidable task of keeping the kingdom united and securing his own power in the face of not only external threats but also internal opposition. Despite his youth and relative inexperience, Alexander demonstrated strategic prowess and a keen understanding of politics. He swiftly moved to consolidate his position, ensuring the loyalty of the Macedonian nobles and executing potential rivals to his throne. As such, he successfully navigated the treacherous waters of succession politics and emerged as the undisputed king of Macedon. However, Alexander's challenges were far from over. He inherited a kingdom that was rife with discontent and facing external pressures from neighboring states. Some Greek city-states, as well as Macedonian satraps, saw this moment as an opportunity to challenge his authority and assert their independence. Amongst his early challenges, the most significant was Thebes, a powerful city-state that had been an ally to Macedon in the past. Thebes, under the leadership of its charismatic orator Demosthenes, decided to revolt against Macedonian rule. Alexander, determined not to let this rebellion go unchallenged, swiftly marched his forces towards Thebes. In a display of his military acumen, Alexander managed to capture Thebes in a matter of weeks. The city was brutally sacked, setting an example for any other city that may have contemplated rebellion. This brutal display of force effectively crushed any resistance and sent a clear message to his rivals. Alexander was a force to be reckoned with, and his rule would not be easily denied. With the immediate threat subdued, Alexander turned his attention to solidifying his rule within Greece. He skillfully coordinated diplomatic efforts, combining political maneuvers with military campaigns to establish his authority over various Greek city-states. Through a combination of military might and persuasive diplomacy, Alexander managed to bring most of Greece under his control. However, Alexander's ambitions did not stop at Greece. He was determined to expand his dominion and fulfill the dream of his father, the conquest of Persia. This ambitious military campaign would test his leadership and military genius, but it would also pave the way for the creation of one of the greatest empires in history. In the spring of 334 BC, now ready to launch his war against the Persian Empire, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. It was the start of one of the greatest military campaigns in history. Alexander's army was about 40,000 strong, drawn from all parts of Greece. The infantry were commanded by the veteran Macedonian general Parmenion. In the front rank, 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, armed with the 18-foot sarissa. These were professional soldiers, well-trained and drilled, who formed up for battle in the phalanx, 16 ranks deep. This packed formation presented a solid wall of iron spear tips and was virtually unstoppable. But it was also difficult to maneuver, and highly vulnerable to attacks on its flanks, or rear. So 3,000 elite infantry, the hypaspists, or shield-bearers, armed with shorter spears, guarded its flanks. They were commanded by Parmenion's son, Nicanor. The second line of Alexander's army was made up of 7,000 Greek allies and 5,000 mercenaries, armed as hoplites. They took their name from the hoplon, their large round shield, and carried shorter 8-foot spears. A hoplite phalanx was not as effective as the Macedonian phalangites, but still well-armed and heavily armored for the time. The Agrianes were the army's elite skirmishers, expert javelin throwers from what's now southern Bulgaria. Other skirmishers from Thrace and Illyria were armed with javelins, slings, and bows. The shock troops of Alexander's army were the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen armed with spear and sword, commanded by Philotas, another son of Parmenion. Alexander led the royal squadron in person. There were also 1,800 cavalry from Thessaly, commanded by Callus, 600 from other parts of Greece, led by Erigius, and 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia, under Cassander. On the other hand, the great Persian Empire was divided into provinces, called satrapies. Each satrapy was ruled by a governor, or satrap. Those in Asia Minor, now threatened by Alexander's invasion, met to discuss strategy. Memnon of Rhodes, a skilled Greek general in Persian service, urged them to avoid battle with Alexander. Instead, he advised them to use a scorched earth strategy, to burn villages and crops, and withdraw to the interior. Alexander's army, he promised, would quickly starve. It was good advice, but the satraps were unwilling to lay waste to their own provinces without a fight. So they decided to face Alexander's army at the river Granicus. The Persian army formed up behind the river, which was shallow but 60 feet wide with steep banks. Their front line was a wall of cavalry, about 1,000 horsemen from across the empire, Medes and Hyrcanians from modern Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, and Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind, in reserve, were the infantry, several thousand Greek mercenaries, a common sight in Persian armies at this time. These men fought for Persian gold and were armed with the round shield and short spear of hoplites. The Persians may have been unsure if they could trust these men in combat against fellow Greeks, and so placed them at the rear. Alexander, determined to attack and destroy this Persian force before it could retreat, raced to the Granicus with his best troops. On his left wing, he posted Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry under Parmenion's command. In the center were the massed spears of the phalanx, its 6 divisions commanded by Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintas, Philip, Meleager, and Crateros. On the right, Alexander himself, with the companion cavalry under Philotas as well, as the elite hypaspists, the Agrianes, javelin throwers, and the archers. Alexander, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry in all, was probably slightly outnumbered. But ignoring advice to wait until dawn to cross the river, he ordered an immediate assault. He sent a squadron of companion cavalry to ford the river, followed by a regiment of hypaspists in the Paeonian light cavalry. Alexander, calling on his men to show their courage, then led his right wing across the river. As they reached the middle of the river, the Greeks came under a hail of javelins, darts, and arrows from the Persian line. Those that made it to the far bank were immediately charged by the Persian cavalry. Alexander was in the thick of the fighting. He attacked where the whole mass of their cavalry and leaders were stationed. Around him, a desperate conflict raged. Horses were jammed against horses and men against men. The Macedonians striving to drive the Persians away from the riverbank, the Persians determined to prevent them crossing and to push them back into the river. Alexander's attack seemed reckless, but he was buying time for the rest of his army to cross the river, including the irresistible Macedonian phalanx. Then suddenly Alexander was fighting for his life, charged by 2 Persian nobles. Rosicus rode up to Alexander and struck him on the head with his sword, breaking off a piece of his helmet. But the helmet broke the force of the blow, and Alexander struck him down with his lance. Then from behind, Spithridates raised his sword against the king, but Black Clitus, son of Dropidas, anticipated his blow, struck his arm, and cut it off, sword and all. Now the Greek army was across the river, and the Persian cavalry faced a wall of Macedonian spears. Most turned and fled. The speed and shock of Alexander's attack meant Persia's Greek mercenaries hadn't even had time to join the... Alexander, enraged or possibly regarding these Greeks as traitors, ignored their appeals for mercy. The mercenaries were surrounded on all sides and massacred. Alexander had won a great victory. Asia Minor now lay at his mercy. But the Persian Empire was still a land of immense wealth and power. Already, it was mobilizing its vast resources to face him. If Alexander was to conquer this empire and take his place in history, he'd next have to face Darius, King of Kings himself.